Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be journeying through a single night in a medieval castle during the year 1320, experiencing the quiet transition from sunset to sunrise as the great fortress settles into its evening rhythms. Make sure to like this video to support our channel, and let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is for you right now. The year was 1320, and Ashford Castle stood sentinel over the valley below, its thick stone walls still warm from the September sun. As the horizon blazed orange and crimson, the fortress began its nightly transformation from a place of bustling activity to one of hushed vigilance. This was not a moment of ceremony, but of routine. The daily rhythm that had repeated itself for nearly 200 years since the first stones were laid by Norman lords who claimed this land as their own. In the great kitchen, the heat still radiated from the massive hearth where the evening meal had been prepared. Roger, the head cook, surveyed his domain with tired satisfaction. The household had been fed, from the lord and lady in the great hall to the lowliest stable boy. 3 whole sheep had been roasted on the turning spit, along with countless loaves of bread, pottages thick with peas and onions, and for the high table, a swan dressed in its own feathers, a dish reserved for only the most important occasions. Now came the work of closing down for the night, the careful process of securing the kitchen until the fires were rekindled before dawn. The scullery maids moved with practiced efficiency, their hands red and chapped from the hot water drawn from the great cauldron that hung over the fire. They scrubbed the wooden trenchers with sand and ash, the rhythmic sound of their work echoing off the vaulted ceiling blackened by decades of smoke. The iron pots, some large enough for a child to hide in, were scoured clean of their evening's labour. Grease and food scraps were carefully saved. Nothing wasted in a household where economy was both virtue and necessity. Even the smallest bit of fat would be used for candles or soap. The pastry cook wrapped the remaining manchet loaves in clean linen, storing them in the wooden aumbry, where they would stay fresh for the morning meal. His assistant banked the smaller ovens, covering the coals with ash, so they would stay alive through the night, ready to be coaxed back to flame before dawn. The art of keeping fire through the long dark hours was not taken lightly. A dead fire meant precious time lost and, more critically, the expense of relighting it with flint and steel, or the embarrassment of borrowing flame from a neighbour's hearth. Roger himself checked the meat safe, a wooden cupboard with pierced tin panels that allowed air to circulate while keeping flies and rats at bay. Tomorrow's provisions hung there: a haunch of venison from the lord's recent hunt, salt pork from the autumn slaughter, strings of onions brought up from the storage cellars. He made mental notes for the morning, calculating what would be needed for the next day's meals. The castle housed over 200 souls on a typical day, and each one needed feeding according to their station. The high table would expect fine white bread and roasted meats, while the servants would receive dark rye bread and pottage. As the kitchen staff finished their final tasks, they gathered their few possessions. Most of them did not sleep in the castle itself, but in the small village that clustered against its outer walls, seeking the protection of the fortress while maintaining their own humble homes. They would return before dawn, when the sky was still black and stars still visible, to begin the endless cycle again. The kitchen boys, however, bedded down near the hearth, curling up on rough pallets of straw with thin woolen blankets. Their job was to tend the fires through the night, to ensure the coals never died completely, and to chase away any rats bold enough to venture near the stored food. Above, in the great hall, the trestle tables had been dismantled and stacked against the walls. The hall, which had been crowded with diners just an hour before, now stood nearly empty, its true vastness revealed. Servants swept the rush-covered floor, gathering up bones and scraps that would go to the hunting dogs kennelled in the bailey. Fresh rushes mixed with sweet woodruff and lavender would be laid down tomorrow. But tonight the old ones were simply tidied, the worst of the debris removed. The smell of the evening meal still lingered in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of smoke and damp stone. The lord of the castle, Sir Edmund, had retired to his private solar with his wife, Lady Catherine. This small chamber, built into the thickness of the castle wall, was their refuge from the relentlessly public nature of medieval life, where even the most private moments were often witnessed by servants and attendants. A brazier burned in the corner, taking the chill off the stone walls that never truly felt warm even in summer. Lady Catherine sat by candlelight, working on her embroidery, a scene of the Annunciation that would eventually adorn the altar cloth in the castle chapel. Sir Edmund reviewed accounts with his steward, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who kept meticulous records. The numbers told the story of the estate, grain yields from the Demesne farms, rents collected from tenant farmers, expenses for repairs to the mill wheel, the cost of iron for the blacksmith. Elsewhere in the castle, the chamberlain made his final rounds, checking that shutters were secured against the night air and candles properly placed in their iron holders, away from anything that might catch fire. Fire was the great terror of these fortresses, despite their stone walls. The wooden roofs and floors, the tapestries and bedding, all could burn, and fire could spread with terrifying speed. He ensured that buckets of water and sand stood ready in their appointed places throughout the castle, ready to douse any spark that might escape its proper confines. In the guards' quarters, the evening watch was preparing to take their posts. 20 men would stand duty through the night, rotating in shifts so that no man stood for more than 4 hours in the cold. They dressed in their padded gambesons, thick quilted coats that provided both warmth and protection. Over these went their mail hauberks for those assigned to the walls, though the inner guards wore only leather jerkins. Each man checked his weapons carefully, spears for the wall guards, swords and cudgels for those who would patrol the interior passages and courtyards. The captain of the guard, Thomas, gave his instructions in the guardroom. His voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had given these same orders 1,000 times before. The gate was to remain barred until dawn. The watchword for the night was Saint Edmund, the old king and martyr. Any person encountered in the castle after the bell for Campline must give this word or be detained for questioning. The wall guards were to watch for lights in the valley and listen for any unusual sounds. Raiders were uncommon in this settled part of the realm, but not unknown, and vigilance was the price of safety. The guards filed out to their posts, their footsteps echoing on the stone stairs that led up to the battlements. The men assigned to the gate took their positions in the small chamber above the portcullis, where they could peer out through arrow slits at the darkening world beyond. The wall guards spread out along the curtain walls, each man responsible for a section of the perimeter, walking their rounds with practiced regularity. From the battlements, the view stretched across miles of countryside, now fading into shadow as the last light left the sky. Cooking fires twinkled in the village below, and in the far distance, the lights of the abbey could be seen, where monks were gathering for their own nighttime offices. The guards stamped their feet against the cold that was already settling in. September nights in this northern country could be bitter, and there would be frost on the grass before morning, the first true taste of the coming winter. Below, in the castle chapel, Father Benedict prepared for Compline, the final service of the day. He was an old man now, bent with years of rising for midnight prayers and dawn masses, his joints stiff and aching in the cold stone church. He lit the candles on the altar with hands that trembled slightly, then struck the bell that called the household to prayer. Its clear tone rang through the castle, a signal that the day was ending and night had come, time to commend oneself to God's protection through the dangerous hours of darkness. Those who were pious or had nothing better to do made their way to the chapel. Lady Catherine came with her ladies-in-waiting, all of them covering their heads with veils as was proper. Some of the household knights attended, along with the steward and a scattering of servants. They knelt on the cold stone floor, no benches or comfort here, and the priest's voice rose in the ancient words of the office. The Latin phrases rolled through the small space, words of protection and blessing for the night ahead, asking that angels watch over the sleeping and guard them from evil. After the service, silence was expected to descend on the castle. This was not the absolute silence of a monastery, where speaking was forbidden after compline, but the quiet of a household at rest. Conversation was kept low, footsteps softened. Those who had legitimate business moved about it quietly. Those who had none sought their beds. The sleeping arrangements in the castle followed the strict hierarchies of the age. Sir Edmund and Lady Catherine had their solar, a private chamber with a real bed, a wooden frame strung with ropes supporting a mattress stuffed with wool and feathers, a luxury beyond the dreams of common folk. Curtains of heavy wool could be drawn around it for warmth and privacy. Their personal servants slept on pallets on the floor of the same room, available if needed in the night, but discreetly turning their backs to give their lord and lady what privacy could be managed. The household knights and men-at-arms slept in the barracks, a long room with simple beds, really just wooden platforms with straw mattresses and rough blankets. Each man had a chest at the foot of his bed for his possessions, and a space on the wall for his weapons and armour, kept ready in case of alarm. They settled in with the ease of soldiers, some talking quietly of the day's events, others falling asleep almost instantly, the gift of men accustomed to sleeping anywhere. The servants who lived in the castle found what space they could. Some slept in the rooms of those they served, others in the kitchen near the warmth of the banked fires, the stable loft above the horses, or in small chambers built into the thickness of the walls. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the very highest ranks. Most people slept communally, finding warmth and security in numbers during the long cold night. In the stables, the grooms made their final checks of the horses. Each animal was valuable, worth more than a common labourer could earn in years. They ensured that each horse had water and hay, that no animal showed signs of colic or lameness. The destriers, the great war horses, shifted in their stalls, massive beasts capable of carrying a fully armoured knight into battle. The palfreys and roundseys, the riding horses, were quieter, used to the routine. The grooms would sleep in the loft above, ready to respond if any horse showed distress in the night. As the hours passed, the castle grew quieter still. The last conversations died away. The last footsteps faded. Only the guards remained wakeful, walking their rounds on the walls and through the passages. The wind picked up, whistling through the arrow slits and making the banners on the towers snap and flutter. The temperature continued to drop. On the walls, the guards pulled their cloaks tighter and kept moving to stay warm. They peered out into the darkness, watching for any sign of movement, listening for unusual sounds. The countryside below was utterly dark, save for the occasional light from a cottage window. The moon had not yet risen, and the stars blazed overhead with a clarity impossible to see in the modern world, untouched by any light but their own distant fires. Around midnight, the changing of the guard took place. Fresh men climbed the stairs to the battlements, while their relieved comrades descended, grateful for the chance to warm themselves by the fire in the guardroom and perhaps catch a few hours of sleep before their next shift. The exchange was done quietly, professionally, the watchword passed and confirmed. In the solar, Sir Edmund and Lady Catherine slept behind their drawn curtains, while their servants dozed on the floor nearby. In the great hall, a few servants slept on benches, wrapped in their cloaks. The kitchen boys tended their fires, occasionally rising to add a bit of fuel to keep the coals alive. Father Benedict woke in his small cell near the chapel. Even in his advanced years, the habit of a lifetime pulled him from sleep for the night offices. He made his way to the chapel and rang the bell for matins, though few would join him at this hour. He prayed alone in the candle-lit space, his voice barely a whisper as he recited the psalms he had known by heart for 50 years. The night deepened, the cold intensified. Frost began to form on the grass in the bailey and on the stones of the battlements. The guards stamped their feet and swung their arms, fighting off the chill. They would be grateful when dawn came and they could be relieved. In the village below the castle, a dog barked, then fell silent. An owl called from the forest, hunting in the darkness. The world slept, and the castle watched over it, a stone guardian that never rested. As the hours before dawn approached, the first stirrings of activity began in the kitchen. The kitchen boys, who had dozed fitfully through the night, rose and began to coax the fires back to full life, adding kindling and blowing on the coals until flames caught and grew. Soon the head cook and his staff would arrive, and the endless work of feeding the household would begin again. The guards on the walls saw the first hint of change in the eastern sky, a barely perceptible lightening of the absolute darkness. Dawn was still more than an hour away, but the night was beginning to release its grip. They knew that soon the bell would ring for Lords, the morning office, and the castle would begin to wake. In the solar, Lady Catherine's maid rose quietly and rekindled the brazier, preparing the room for her lady's waking. In the barracks, the men who would form the day watch began to stir, groaning and stretching, reluctant to leave the relative warmth of their blankets but knowing duty called. The sky continued to lighten, slowly, gradually. The stars began to fade. The guards on the walls could now make out the shapes of the landscape below, the village, the fields, the dark line of the forest in the distance. Another night had passed safely. Another day was beginning. As the sun finally broke above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the castle came fully alive. The gate was unbarred. The day workers began to arrive from the village. Smoke rose from cooking fires throughout the fortress. The night watch was relieved and made their way to their beds, ready to sleep through the day before rising to stand guard again when darkness fell. The cycle was complete. From sunset to sunrise, the castle had maintained its vigil, a small world unto itself, governed by rhythms as old as the stone walls that contained it. And tonight, when the sun set once more, the whole pattern would repeat, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, until the age of castles finally passed into history. If you are enjoying this content, we would love for you to join our community of nighttime travelers. Please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel and never miss a journey through history. The year was 1285, and Berkshire Castle rose from the rocky hilltop like a crown of grey stone, its towers catching the last rays of the August sun. As evening descended, the fortress prepared for night, a carefully orchestrated transition that had been perfected over generations of castellans and their households. This was the castle of Lord Richard, a baron of modest holdings but ancient lineage, and within its walls lived nearly 150 souls who depended on the smooth running of this stone community. In the buttery and pantry, the provisions for tomorrow were being carefully accounted for and stored. Hugh, the pantler, moved among the shelves with a tally stick in hand, marking notches to record what remained of the week's supplies. Barrels of ale stood in rows, each one marked with chalk to indicate when it had been broached. The pantry held wheels of cheese, some as large as cartwheels, wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. Loaves of bread were stacked on wooden boards, the fine white manchet separated from the coarser maslin and the dark horse bread that would feed the lowest servants. Hugh's assistant swept the floor of the pantry, ensuring no crumbs remained to attract mice or rats. Despite the castle's cats, rodents were an endless battle, and vigilance was required. The shelves were checked for any signs of droppings or gnawing. A single contaminated barrel could spoil an entire week's supply of grain or flour. When the sweeping was done, the assistant scattered fresh herbs on the floor, pennyroyal and tansy, plants believed to repel vermin. In the buttery next door, the butler oversaw the wine stores. The Lord's wine came from Gascony, transported in great casks and then transferred to smaller vessels for serving. The better wines were kept in a separate locked room, their value too great to leave unguarded. The butler checked each barrel's level, ensuring that none of the servants had been helping themselves. Pilferage was a constant concern in any large household, and the butler's reputation depended on maintaining strict control over his domain. As the work concluded, Hugh locked the pantry and buttery doors, hanging the large iron keys from his belt. These keys were a symbol of his authority and responsibility. He would sleep with them under his pillow, and no one would access these rooms until he unlocked them again in the morning. The security of the household's food supply rested on his shoulders. Meanwhile, in the great hall, the evening meal was ending. The lord and lady had dined at the high table on a platform at one end of the hall, elevated above the rest of the household. Below them, the household had eaten according to their rank, knights and ladies near the high table, servants and men-at-arms further away. Now the minstrel was finishing his last song, a ballad of Roland and Oliver that had kept the diners entertained. His voice echoed off the high ceiling, the notes lingering in the smoky air. The servers began clearing the tables, moving efficiently despite the crowded conditions. Wooden trenchers were stacked, some to be washed, others soaked with gravy and grease, to be given to the beggars who waited at the gate each evening. This distribution of scraps was both charity and obligation, a lord's duty to feed the poor from his abundance. The almoner supervised this distribution, ensuring that the neediest received their share. The trestle tables were disassembled, the boards lifted from their supports and stacked against the walls. The great hall would serve as sleeping quarters for many of the household tonight. The benches that had served as seats during the meal would become beds, supplemented by straw pallets laid out on the floor. This was the common sleeping arrangement for servants and the lower-ranking members of the household. Lady Margaret, the lord's wife, rose from the high table and made her way to the women's quarters, followed by her ladies in waiting. These chambers were in the keep, up 2 flights of narrow spiral stairs. The ladies walked carefully, their long skirts held up to avoid tripping, candles in hand to light the dark stairway. The women's quarters consisted of 2 rooms, one for Lady Margaret and her closest attendants, another for the other ladies of the household. In Lady Margaret's chamber, the waiting women prepared the room for night. Fresh candles were placed in the wall sconces, replacing those that had burned down during the day. The bed, A substantial piece of furniture with a wooden frame and rope supports was checked and made ready. The mattress, stuffed with wool, was shaken and smoothed. Clean linen sheets were laid out, a luxury that spoke to the household's status. Coarser households made do with sheets, changed once a month or less, but Lady Margaret insisted on fresh linens weekly. A maidservant brought warm water in a copper basin so that Lady Margaret could wash her face and hands before retiring. The water had been heated in the kitchen and carried up the stairs, still steaming slightly in the cool evening air. Soap made from tallow and wood ash sat ready, along with clean linen towels. These small comforts of cleanliness were important to Lady Margaret, who had been raised in a household that valued such refinements. While Lady Margaret prepared for bed, her husband remained below, conducting business in a small chamber off the Great Hall. Lord Richard met with his reeve, the man who managed the castle's agricultural lands. They discussed the upcoming harvest, which looked promising this year after 2 years of poor yields. The reeve reported on the condition of the fields, the progress of the wheat and barley, the state of the orchards. Decisions were made about when to begin the harvest, how many workers would be needed, what portion would go to the Lord's granary, and what would be owed to the church as tithes. The steward joined them, bringing accounts written on parchment. By the light of several candles, they reviewed expenses and income. A new roof was needed for one of the barns. The mill required repairs to its water wheel. A dispute between 2 tenant farmers needed to be settled. The business of managing an estate was endless, and Lord Richard attended to it with the diligence expected of his station. Outside in the bailey, the courtyard enclosed by the castle walls, the stables were being secured for the night. The head groom walked through the long stable building, checking each stall. The horses, some 24 of them, were the lifeblood of the castle. Without them, there could be no hunting, no travel, no warfare. Each animal represented a significant investment and received careful attention. The groom checked that each horse had adequate hay and water for the night. He ran his hands over their legs, feeling for any heat or swelling that might indicate injury. The Lord's palfrey, a gentle grey mare, nickered softly at his touch. The destrier, a massive black stallion used for warfare and tournaments, stamped impatiently in his reinforced stall. This horse was temperamental and dangerous, trained to bite and kick in battle, and only the most experienced grooms handled him. Satisfied that all was well, the groom extinguished most of the lanterns in the stable, leaving only one burning near the door. The horses settled into their stalls, some lying down, others standing to sleep in the way of horses. The groom would sleep in a small room at the end of the stable, ready to respond if any horse became distressed during the night. On the castle walls, the evening guard had taken their positions. Unlike the larger castle in our previous story, Berkshire Castle maintained a smaller force, only 12 men on duty through the night. They wore leather jerkins and carried spears, adequate for watching and raising an alarm, though not equipped for sustained combat. Their role was vigilance, not battle. The sergeant of the watch made his rounds, checking that each man was at his post and alert. The watchword tonight was St. George, and he tested each guard by challenging them. The guards responded correctly, and he moved on, satisfied. From the walls, they could see the land stretching out in all directions, fields and forests fading into darkness as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon. In the castle chapel, a small stone building in the bailey, the chaplain prepared for vespers. Father Andrew was younger than Father Benedict from our other castle, a man in his 30s who had come to this position only 2 years before. He lit the candles on the simple altar and rang the bell, its tone lighter and sweeter than the deeper bell of the larger castle. The household members who attended Vespers were fewer here, perhaps 20 people in total. Lady Margaret came with 3 of her ladies. Several servants attended, those who were particularly devout or who simply enjoyed the quiet moment of prayer. The chaplain's voice rose in the familiar Latin prayers, the words of the evening office that had been said in churches and chapels across Christendom for centuries. After the service, the chapel emptied quickly. The courtyard was now fully dark, lit only by torches burning in brackets on the walls. Their flickering light cast dancing shadows across the cobblestones. A servant moved among them, ensuring each torch was secure and burning properly. The castle could not afford to be dark, both for safety and to discourage any who might contemplate mischief under cover of night. In the kitchens, the last work was being completed. The cook's assistant scrubbed the great table where meat had been prepared, scouring it with salt and sand until the wood was clean. The fire in the hearth was banked, covered with ash to preserve the coals through the night. Tomorrow morning, these coals would be uncovered and coaxed back to flame, saving the time and effort of starting a fire anew. The cook himself, a stocky man named Peter, made a final inventory of what would be needed for tomorrow's meals. The Lord expected a good table, and Peter took pride in providing it. He noted that they were running low on certain spices and would need to draw from the locked spice cupboard, which required the steward's key. Spices were expensive, worth more than their weight in silver, and were kept under careful guard. Peter's young apprentice, a boy of 12, prepared his sleeping place near the kitchen hearth. He would sleep here, responsible for keeping the fire alive and for beginning the morning's work before the rest of the staff arrived. It was a position of some responsibility for one so young, and the boy took it seriously, knowing that advancement in the household depended on proving oneself reliable. In the great hall, pallets were being laid out for those who would sleep there. Servants brought armfuls of straw from the storage rooms, spreading it on the floor and covering it with rough blankets. The hall would house perhaps 30 people tonight, men and women sleeping in the same space, though on opposite sides of the room, separated by convention and the watchful eye of the marshal who was responsible for maintaining order. The fire in the great hearth was built up high, for the night would be cold despite the summer season. The smoke rose to the rafters and escaped through the louvered opening in the roof, though much of it remained, hanging in the upper reaches of the hall. Those who slept here were accustomed to it, as were all medieval people who lived with smoke as a constant companion. Lord Richard finally retired to his chamber in the keep, climbing the spiral stairs to the Lord's solar. This room was directly above his wife's chamber, connected by a small private stairway. It served as his office and, when desired, his sleeping room, though often he joined his wife in her larger chamber below. Tonight, however, he had work to finish, correspondence to write by candlelight. He sat at a small table, quill in hand, and composed a letter to a neighbouring lord regarding a matter of mutual concern. The parchment was expensive, each sheet precious, so his words were carefully chosen. When he made an error, he scraped the ink away with a knife and continued. The letter completed, he sealed it with his signet ring pressed into warm wax, the imprint showing his coat of arms. The castle settled into its nighttime rhythm. The guards walked their rounds on the walls, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. In the village below the castle, lights were extinguished as families banked their fires and went to bed. The working day began at dawn and required rest. Around midnight, the watch changed. Fresh guards climbed to the walls, while the first watch descended to the guard room, where a fire burned and ale was available to warm them. They would rest here until called for the next watch, dozing on benches or on the floor. The sergeant recorded the change in his log, noting that all was quiet and no unusual activity had been observed. In the women's chambers, all was still. Lady Margaret slept in her bed, curtains drawn against the draught. Her ladies slept on pallets on the floor, 3 young women whose families had sent them to serve in the household, learning the skills and manners expected of their class. One of them stirred restlessly, troubled by dreams, then settled back into sleep. The night deepened. The moon rose near full, casting silver light across the castle walls and the countryside beyond. By its light, the guards could see clearly the landscape rendered in shades of grey and black. An owl hunted in the fields below, its silent flight taking it past the castle walls. One of the guards watched it, a momentary distraction from the tedium of his watch. In the chapel, Father Andrew woke for the night office of matins. Unlike Father Benedict, who prayed alone, Father Andrew was joined by 2 lay brothers, men who had taken informal vows and assisted with the chapel's upkeep. Together they recited the psalms, their voices low in the dark chapel, lit only by the sanctuary lamp that burned perpetually before the altar. The cold intensified as the hours passed. Frost began to form in the shadowed corners of the bailey. The guards on the walls wrapped their cloaks tighter and stamped their feet. They would be glad when dawn came and they could seek their beds. In the kitchen, the apprentice woke and checked the fire, adding a bit of wood to ensure the coals stayed alive. He was diligent in this duty, knowing the cook would be angry if he had to restart the fire in the morning. The boy settled back onto his pallet, pulling his thin blanket around him, and drifted back to sleep. The hours before dawn were the quietest, the time when the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the dogs in the kennel were silent, curled up together for warmth. The castle waited, patient and watchful, for the sun to return. As the first hints of grey appeared in the eastern sky, activity began to stir. The kitchen boy rose and began building up the fire in earnest, adding kindling and blowing on the coals until flames caught and spread. Soon Peter and the other kitchen staff would arrive from the village, and the work of preparing breakfast would begin. In the great hall, early risers began to wake, folding their blankets and rolling up the straw pallets. The fire had burned low during the night, and a servant added fresh logs, coaxing it back to warmth. The marshal moved among the sleepers, quietly waking those whose duties required an early start. The guards on the walls saw the sky lighten gradually, the stars fading one by one. The moon, which had been so bright at midnight, now seemed pale and ghostly. The landscape emerged from darkness, the familiar fields and forests taking shape in the growing light. Lord Richard rose early, as was his custom, and descended to the chapel for the office of Lords. Father Andrew was already there preparing the altar. They prayed together as the sun broke above the horizon, its light streaming through the narrow windows of the chapel, illuminating the rising smoke of incense. The castle gate was unbarred and opened as the sun fully rose. Workers from the village began to arrive, heading to their various duties. The drawbridge was lowered with a rumble of chains and timber. A new day had begun at Berkshire Castle, and with it the endless cycle of work and vigilance that sustained this small world of stone and timber, lord and servant, prayer and duty. The night had passed safely once more, and the castle stood ready to face whatever the day might bring, as it had for generations, as it would for generations to come.